On today's show, we talk with Dr. Bill Harrison, and we talk about vision and the role it plays in baseball.
Welcome to another episode of the Baseball Awakening Podcast, where we dive into the raw, unfiltered, unsexy side of player development. Get ready for some knowledge bombs with your host, Jeff Rotmeyer.
Welcome to the Baseball Awakening Podcast. I'm Jeff Rotmeyer, and today we sit down with Dr. Bill Harrison of slowthegamedown.com. Again, that is slowthegamedown.com. Dr. Bill has a long bio, but I'm going to shorten it up a little bit. But Dr. Bill began his work in professional baseball in 1971 with the Kansas City Royals. Baseball Hall of Fame George Brett was among his first players that he had trained. And over the years, he trained many great athletes. Since then, he's worked with 12 major league organizations and many NCAA baseball programs. Most recently, he worked with the Blue Jays and the Giants. He's also a frequent contributor to the Collegiate Baseball News, as well as co-authoring with his son Ryan Harrison on 3 books: How to Focus Like the Pros, How to Focus the Hitter's Zone, and How to Focus the Pitcher's Zone. So with all that, Dr. Bill, how are you, sir?
Just fine, thank you. Good speaking with you, Jeff.
You too. You know, Dr. Bill, you've been at this thing now since 1971, when you were brought in by the Kansas City Royals to do, from my understanding, an experiment. And this experiment started with a handful of guys, with George Brett being one of them. And since then, you started working with a bunch of different organizations and a bunch of college programs. And so you would be considered a visual performance coach. How would you describe exactly what a visual performance coach does?
Okay, well, let me clarify one thing. I really wasn't brought in as an experiment with the Royals, as it sounded, from the standpoint that I was very impressed in an article I read in Sports Illustrated about the Kansas City Royal Baseball Academy. And they had just finished their first year in Sarasota, Florida. And it was the bright idea of Mr. Ewing Kaufman, the owner. And so I simply wrote Mr. Kaufman a letter. Back in the day, of course, we didn't have the digital communications and so on. Right. I didn't necessarily expect he'd ever read it, but I complimented him because not only because their academy was so progressive, something I wish I could have done when I got out of just a few years earlier, gotten out of school, but also the fact that he was impressed upon selecting players who had 3 or 4 characteristics. They didn't have to be baseball players. They had to have running speed. They had to have lateral movement. They had to have throwing arm speed. And he wanted 20/15 eyesight. And so that was really unusual to me as an eye doctor. It's like, wow, you're interested in vision. So I complimented him on that. And lo and behold, one morning, and my schedule was quiet. I got a call from Mr. Kaufman directly, and we spoke for an hour and a half. And he said, I'm really fascinated in what you can do. And he said the team is going to be in the Kansas City Royals are going to be in Oakland. This is like September 71. And I'd like for you to evaluate at least one player. That was sort of the experiment part of it. Okay. And I evaluated the player and sent a report. And Mr. Kaufman called me and says, well, can we send Ed Kirkpatrick and our sports psychologist out for a week with you? And I sure, absolutely. That was probably in November of 71. And Ed Kirkpatrick was they didn't have when he was signed as almost like a 17-year-old by the California Angels, but the Royals had picked him up, and they weren't satisfied that he was performing to his level of potential, and So sure enough, we found some vision issues in the evaluation, but also was able to get Ed understanding how he could see the ball much better, but he wanted to work on it. So he came out for a week. The sports psychologist came. He was very negative. He was very much against it. He had to fly in from Florida. But by the time they left at the end of the week, they were both excited that this was going to be significant in Ed's career. And they recommended to Mr. Kaufman that he extend it to more players. So Mr. Kaufman called me a couple of weeks later, and he says, I've got, I don't know, something like 18 players that I'd like for you to come to Kansas City in January and work with these players. And ironically, George was not one of them. Come to think of it, it was like 15 players in Kansas City. And he said, I've got 3 young players in California. Would you possibly willing to see them? I said, sure. So they came about the 7th to 10th of December, and that was George. George was just 18. He'd signed in the prior June. And anyway, we went on and worked with the players in Kansas City, which involved Lou Pernella and Amos Otis, a lot of pretty good players, Freddie Patek. And one in particular, Mr. Kaufman did call me, says, I have one more young player I'd like you to see. Would it be possible we could squeeze him in? I said, well, sure. And his name was Frank White. So we had some great experience with some very interesting players and talent at that time. And it was all about training them to be able to use their eyes, their brain, and their body better together so they could see the ball, track the ball, have better eye-hand coordination, and really a lot about how to improve their focus so they could have better focus defensively, running the bases, throwing, hitting, bunting, so on. And, we had some very willing young guys willing to get better, and they got some pretty good results.
Yeah, that part is fascinating to me. Whenever, I read your stuff on slowthegame.com and your book, the whole eye, mind, body working together. And I think it's one of those things that not enough people understand this concept and how important it is, especially when you got a guy throwing 95 with movement. So
that's right.
So it's interesting that, to me, that, one of the first lessons we ever got as a young player is see the ball. And it's kind of assumed that everyone knows what that means. And really nobody has really been taught on what that really means. How do you see the ball? So I think we're missing this part. So what to look for, how to do that, and stuff like that. So can you talk a little bit about the how-to part?
Well, you're absolutely right, Jeff. It would be very interesting or very easy if you just walked out in your backyard. It was to look at the ball or look at the bird or look at the whatever. That's easy to do. But when you come to the game of baseball, there's so much going on, and you listeners and coaches could describe it even far better than I. But all of the sound, all of the movement, and obviously it changes and can get very intense. Let's call it chaotic, okay? And it can get very, very chaotic. So how do you do it when it gets chaotic? And part of that chaos is the different kind of deliveries. So, for example, as a right-handed hitter, maybe I can see the ball pretty well from a left-handed pitcher throwing over the top, but how do I see it from a right-hander with a three-quarter or maybe even a submarine or sidearm or over the top? I mean, all these different deliveries. And I know when I kind of got excited about helping players, I realized I played for, I don't know how many years, probably 10 years through youth ball, high school, and college. I played 4 years at University of California at Berkeley. And it's like no one ever mentioned anything about how to see the ball. So how do you see it? Well, obviously, you make it a priority. And that's easy to it sounds easy, but that's not easy to do when you think I've got to get a hit right now. If I don't get a hit, they're going to pull me out of the lineup, or some other. And so I would say the number one probably hurdle is thinking too much. So you mentioned the eye, mind, and body, and I used to use that phrase. Today I prefer to use the eyes, because there's two eyes, and the brain and the body.
The brain.
Eyes, brain, and body. And here's the deal. The brain it's everything. And that's what you're training with all of the drills and all of the, everything that goes into getting better is training the brain, so the brain can take over. But the interesting thing about it is at that moment that the ball is being pitched, that half a second, less than half a second, the best performance is when the brain becomes quiet. It's not active consciously. Certainly it works subconsciously. But the brain needs to be quieted down. So one of the things that we learned a long time ago was if there's a lot of noise and a lot of talking, and so coaches, I would say if there's one thing I would try to make as a requirement in a game is no one talks to the player, including you as a coach, when the player steps in the box. When the player steps in the box, he cannot be thinking about where his hands are, his feet are, his launch angle, whatever it may be. He's got to let all that go. If he's thinking about it, or the fact, look for the curveball, he can't think about those things. He can be told that on the bench, in the on-deck circle, but once he steps in the box, he should own that exclusively. There should be no more signals, no more signs. He's got to just focus on seeing the ball. So you mentioned George Brett. Wow, how was I such a lucky fella that in December 1971, I connected with this young man who looked like a surfer from California beaches, and he was, sort of. He wasn't a very good player from what most people said, even though back now, people say, oh, yeah, he was a great high school kid. Well, he was good, but he didn't hit that well in rookie ball. But George wanted to get better. And the interesting thing about it is it really had a lot to do with his brother, Kenny. Kenny was, 3 years older and had a great career. But he was pitching in the World Series when he was 19 years of age. I don't think George ever wanted to be a pitcher, but he wanted to be a better hitter than Kenny. Kenny was a pretty good hitter. And George wanted to do everything he could to get better. So he took my recommendations. You know how you get players who will really listen to you, and I mean, I'm so fortunate the first player was one who really listened. And he made seeing the ball as a priority. For example, after each pitch, and I think this is something that every player today needs to be taught, George had one thought: how well did I see the ball? That's after each pitch. Now, if he hit the ball, he wasn't that concerned about. But if it was a pitch he popped up, or he took the pitch, or he swung and missed, which he didn't do too often, how well did he see the ball? Now, in doing that, he learned that when he took a pitch, he really saw the ball well. As a matter of fact, if he took a pitch 3-0, and after that pitch, it's like, oh, why did the coach have me take the pitch? It looked great. I remember seeing that ball come around the pitcher's hand, and it slowed down, and it just looked like a beach ball for me to crush. Well, that was his standard. That's what we today call a 10. In other words, you saw that ball a 10. And we like using numbers to quantify it. We didn't do that so much with George. It was more just how well did you see the pitch. Now, if he didn't see the ball well, this is between pitches, he would just simply to himself say, come on, George, perk it up. See the ball like you know you can. And then you step back in the box, think of nothing. And the one thing we got him doing, and he did it very well, is to get a rocking rhythm. He got a little movement going from left to right, left to right. And the other thing that he did is he looked around on the field a lot. He didn't stare, because it got him to understand is he really didn't need to focus in until the ball was released. He could waste a lot of time and a lot of energy if he did it before. So he stayed real relaxed when he was right until the pitcher was just about ready to release the ball, and then he really zoomed in. And he would see the ball out of the pitcher's hand most of the time. And then he would stay with it, because some players, and you probably can think of as a coach and a hitter, it's easy sometimes to see it early and then let it go. No, it's got to be zoomed in all the way, and we can talk a little bit later, but it's about trying to see the ball deep to contact. That deep doesn't mean into the catcher's glove, but it means to contact point. Right. And he knew when it was right, when it was a 10. And he would, between pitches, he would amp it up if it wasn't. And if he did see a 10, even though he fouled it back or took the pitch or whatever, he would just say, okay, just, stay relaxed and let's do it again. Let's get him. And he had a really simple, repeatable routine while he's in the box. Now, George also, on the brain side, and we taught him this, he didn't know anything about it, he became really great at picturing the opposing pitcher's pitches and seeing what those pitches would look like and feeling his actions, whether it be taking the pitch or driving it up the middle, which was primarily his focus. But he would actually he would practice. Besides physical practice, he'd do a lot of mental practice, but it was really visual thinking. And it became almost like a natural way for him to think about the game. So he would picture his actions, but once he got in the box, he would not think much about that at all, but just see the ball.
See the ball. Yeah, and so when you talk about visualization, is that something that you teach? So how do you teach visualization?
Well, was your question, how do you teach visualization?
Yeah, because we can tell a kid, maybe, hey, make sure you're visualizing, but we can't really see what they are seeing.
Yeah. Well, here's one thing that I would say. I don't like the word visualization. And yet it's okay to use it, but I want to get some clarity. It's really just visual thinking. It's a form of thinking. Now, most young people in school obviously do a ton of verbal thinking, and that's kind of the thought process is typically verbal. And as an athlete, there should be very few words involved. A key word here or there, maybe, but not a string of words.
Right.
Visual thinking is more like seeing yourself receive a ground ball, catch the ball, and make the throw to wherever first base, I assume. Now, how do you teach that? Well, it's not easy. One first thing is you make them alert to the fact that it is a factor. And one of the better ways is I'd like to choose successful actions. And so even playing catch or fielding or bunting, hitting, is immediately after doing something well. I call replay, but you could call it recall. Recall exactly what you remember seeing. What did it look like when you did it? And just leave it at that. In other words, don't take it very far. Just have them replay what they did when they did something well. That will put them in touch to visual thinking. Now, let's say that in batting practice, I hit some line drives and they have the exact action that you want. Have them replay it immediately. Recall what they remember seeing and what they remember feeling. And then later, encourage them to recall that just before a pitch. So I call it pre-play. So they replay and they pre-play. And they just work on that. Now, they have to understand there's no guarantee there that that's going to produce results. They just do it. It just becomes a form of thought that they get in the habit of doing it, and usually, I mean, I've never had any kickback to say that's not helpful. It's almost always like, well, that's pretty amazing.
Sure. Yeah.
But every player's different. I do know this, that it'll never hurt them. The emphasis on seeing the ball as well as possible and trying to get better at it. I've never had a player come back to me with any kind of a complaint or confusion or frustration. The ability to picture successful actions right after they've been done. Never seen that cause an issue. So there's no negative there, and oftentimes it does enhance a player's performance.
Receive a Baseball Awakening decal by subscribing on iTunes and leaving an objective review. To claim your decals, screenshot the review and email it to Jeff@baseballawakening.com. That's GEOFF at baseballawakening.com, and we'll get that your way.
Right. And Dr. Bill, I like the idea of replaying your success, the pre-play. That gets you away from kind of thinking about where your hands are, where your feet are, or kind of thinking about any negative thought. You're constantly replaying your successful at bat. And really, you're playing that over and over and over. Now, you're not overdoing in terms of overanalyzing, but you're not thinking a lot about what you need to do.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, realistically, you can incorporate all the right mechanics in a good visual thought. And as a matter of fact, you could even encourage that when they're not in the cage, that they have visual thinking as if they are in the cage. They could actually have batting practice without having live batting practice. Is it as good? No. But it's sure better than nothing. It's going to get them ready, as opposed to stepping into the cage cold, with a dead brain, if you will.
Yeah, and that takes that takes away from the mindless work. There's a lot of mindless work that's going on.
Right. And so, by the way, there's no magic to that. It's just thinking as an athlete. It's what I would call athletic thinking as opposed to academic thinking. And I want to mention a couple of things because I know you have several coaches listening. See, coaches tend to do this very well. Coaches, just through the process of coaching, I mean, you're visual thinkers, I'm sure, and you see everything in advance, and it's automatic. It's hard to believe your players don't do the same thing, but they don't have the same experiences that you have, and they don't do the same thing. And you're right, they will tend to think about all kinds of the wrong things. Whereas to you, it's so obvious they should be thinking about, hitting that, shot to left center, right center, or whatever. They're thinking more about, gosh, I better hit it, or, I hope my hands end up in the right spot, or whatever. So part of it is to get them to think like you do.
Yeah, right. And a lot of that comes with experience. And I think we get these younger guys, they got to get the experience, the right stuff. They got to experience the wrong way. And you got to be patient with that process.
That's right. Exactly. And, while you say that, we just with a major league player the other day who's very, very good. And, asked him the question, how many at-bats did he have? Well, he had nearly 600 at-bats during the season. Well, we know that the major league average, this is Major League Baseball, but there's, you can break this all the way down to Little League. The average is about 4 pitches per at-bat. So he spent his whole season, he saw 2,400 pitches. High school kid might see 400 pitches, and maybe a youth league might see 200 pitches. But typically in the major leagues, about half of those are taken as balls. They swing at a little less than 50%. And, obviously some a little more than others. But let's say that hitters swings at 50% of those pitches. So the major leaguer, he swung at 1,200. Your high school player maybe swung at 200, and your youth player maybe 50. Okay, the question that we'd like to ask them is, what percentage of those swings were absolutely perfect? And we are just amazed at the results, the answers we get. The undeveloped player, and sometimes even like a young major leaguer, they might say 20, 30, 40, 50% were perfect swings. The veteran guys, the successful guys, 5% or less. Player the other day said, I don't think I ever have a perfect swing. But he says, I don't care. I'm just swinging. I'm not trying to get the perfect swing. But some, are different. They'll strive. Now, the question is, of all of those pitches, say the 2,400 in the case of the Major League, what percentage of those pitches, balls and balls you swung at and balls you took, what percentage of those did you see really well? And, we'll hear a little higher number, but pretty low. Probably 10%, 20%. So the players that we're going to work with, we say, well, look, here's our goal. You're not going to get perfect. It'd be nice if you were, but let's increase by 10%. Let's see 10% more pitches. In his case, 240 pitches next season. Let's see them really well. Let's increase it by 10%. What will that do for you? Oh my gosh. I'll get, increase my home runs and increase my hits and so forth. Well, some will get caught. But that's kind of realistic of a player that is, playing during the season, is to just focus on increasing it by 10%. So, how do we do it? Well, one thing the hitters don't do is they tend not to pay very careful attention to where exactly a pitcher releases the ball. Mm-hmm. Now, for example, let's say we have a pitcher throwing right over the top. And so we can all visual thinking, we can visualize that pitcher out there throwing over the top. But before he throws over the top, he's standing there on the mound. In relationship to his body, where is that ball released? Well, you'd probably first easy to think that he probably releases it 6 inches above his ear or ear level or whatever. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah.
Well, most pitchers release the ball armpit high when they're coming over the top. That's because they come down the mound, and at the moment of release, everything is lowered. Now that we think about it, it's pretty easy to realize that. But we all tend to look too high. We look over the release, and we adjust to the ball, but we don't pick it up immediately. We pick it up later.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, on deck circle, one of the key things that a guy needs to do in the on deck circle is really see where that guy's release zone is in relation to the height of his body and, of course, off to the side or out front, so that when he's hitting, he knows that's where he's got to get his attention, to that release area. But you're not going to do it right if you don't know what it is, because here's the other thing, Jeff. Eyes are designed. This is the way the brain works and the eyes work, is to see motion and movement in peripheral vision. So the eyes tend to react to, the glove or to the front leg or whatever, or obviously if a second baseman or shortstop is moving or a base runner is stealing, the eyes tend to go to that. They don't tend to go to the central area. And they can, and that's what you want. You want to keep your vision centrally focused. And to clarify on that, there's really like two different types of eyes. And one is peripheral vision, where you see everything, but you don't see any detail. You just see movement. You see a flash of light and you see movement. Or central vision. And there's parts of the eye that allow for central vision. They're very narrow. It's a very small area. But the times that you've seen the seams, you've seen the direction of the seams, you've seen the rate of speed of the seams, that's when you've used central vision. And so I ask you, when you think back as a player, when you saw the seams spinning, the direction they were going and the rate of spin, how well did you see the ball?
Yeah, honestly, as I think about it, probably not as well as I could have. You know, I mean, I got better as I got older, but I still don't think I really, now that I'm thinking about it, I really don't think I understood what was supposed to be happening.
But you didn't see the spin, is what you're saying.
Not as consistently as I probably could have, you know, had I known.
Well, let me see. See, that was very basic. You could have been taught how to see the ball spinning, the direction of it, and the rate of spin. It would not have disrupted you mechanically. It would not have hurt you in any way. It probably would have helped you. Now, that doesn't mean you weren't successful. That doesn't mean you still couldn't hit.
Right.
You probably hit the fastball really well.
Yeah, I hit the fastball really well.
But maybe certain off-speed pitches you didn't see. You didn't have that information.
Yeah.
So part of using the eyes correctly, like how to see, is there's a lot of information. Do you process it? No. Or how did you process it? Or would it be better if you did process it? And today, like in the major league, you know, they're starting to throw a lot more spinning pitches. And if you can see the direction of the spin and the rate of spin, in addition to the trajectory of the ball, now you know whether that ball is going to be in the zone, has a chance of being in your hit zone, or if it's going to be something that, you know, if you swing at, you're going to end up chasing because it's going to be in the dirt or wherever.
Mm-hmm.
So that central vision, here's what happens. When you see the ball, this is what I think is critical. And this really is the brain, but it's the eyes feeding the brain. When you see the ball in peripheral vision, here's what happens. The ball looks smaller. It looks faster, which isn't always bad because it gets you going. And it seems to move even more when it moves, particularly late. Seen in peripheral vision, it's like, wow, that thing was a double break or whatever. Now, when you see it in central vision, the ball, first, you do see that when you see it in central vision, you see the spin and the direction of the spin. The ball looks larger. The ball looks slower. And in no way does it seem to move nearly as much. It moves less. And when you start seeing it that way, it becomes a little bit easier to square that ball on a regular basis. Now, give you a case in point. Let's say you're playing in a game, and the leadoff, your number two hitter, leadoff hitter goes up, and boy, he just gets worked over on the first 3-4 pitches. And he's coming back to the dugout, you're walking out, and he says, that guy is nasty. My gosh, I couldn't, the guy is really tough. Now, you get up there, and you pick up the ball right out of the release, and you see the spin, and you track the ball really good, and you stay with it, and you crush a double. And you're thinking, what's the guy talking about? I mean, in other words, when you think back later, why was he telling me that guy was so tough? He wasn't tough at all. So the point is this, I'm trying to make is, if you see the ball in central vision, it doesn't look as nasty. And sometimes when you get spooked because a player or several players on the team talk about how tough that guy is, it's because they're not looking at the ball right. They're not seeing it correct. And they're giving you misinformation. And you as a hitter have to just ignore that, not get spooked by what others are saying or doing.
I love that. And so can you talk a little bit about picking up the ball and then tracking the ball? Which is that two different things?
Yeah, they're kind of. You're right. They're kind of two different things. Let's take it defensively, and then you can convert it as a hitter. But defensively, the tendency from center field, left field, third base, first base is to see way too much. And there's also a tendency, and I think this is the one thing that is so difficult, and I don't know that I've really been successful in helping as many guys understand this as I would like. one of the worst things to vision and seeing the ball defensively or as a hitter is staring. Staring is good for a half a second or a second, but then it falls apart. So what you don't want your players is staring to where they want to see the ball. They want to look at that area, but they don't have to keep looking at it. They can look away. They can look at different places, and then they come back to it. They need to know when to come back. They got to come back on time, but they don't want to stare. Now, the next thing is maybe having some kind of a habit. So what we teach our defensive players to do is to have a place between themselves and the contact zone of the hitter. In other words, identify where the ball is going to be hit. So if I'm playing third base or first base, and it's a left-handed hitter or a right-handed hitter, what's the contact zone that he can make contact? It's out in front a little bit in most cases, and that keeps me, because I want to end up looking there. I don't want to look at the hitter himself. I don't want to look at the catcher or the umpire. I want to see the contact area. Now, once I've identified that, I can look back to close to myself and look down at the ground and see a spot on the ground. And I could, look out at the zone, back to the spot, back to the zone again. The interesting thing about it, now this may sound a little bit strange, but if you have a specific spot and you know where you're going to look, and you've already been there, if you look away and look back, when you look back the second time, you see better than you did the first time. So it's like you need to preset your focus point, have a spot to look away, and then directly back to the area. So in defense, see, I'm not a big fan on defense of watching the pitcher very much. You watch him. But at the time that he goes into motion, you do not need to see the pitcher. You do not need to see the pitch in your central vision. You need to switch your eyes ahead to the contact area. So you get to where the action's going to take place, and you'll see the ball right off the bat. And as a result, you'll react effectively.
I'm Jim Brotmeyer, and thank you for listening to our conversation on the Baseball Awakening podcast. Stay tuned for part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Bill Harrison tomorrow.